Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take another look at CSS Colors. This video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on an introduction to HTML and CSS. In this video, we are going to specifically look at a couple of different ways in which you can assign colors using CSS. Now, we've done so in some earlier videos, but we just leveraged the named colors. And in this video, we're going to take a look at some alternate ways of assigning those colors. Specifically, we're going to take a look at the RGB function, the hexadecimal format, and also the HSL function, although we're not going to spend quite as much time on HSL. Now, to get started, I provided you with the W3 Schools CSS Colors link. There's actually a couple of different pages I would encourage you to look at. I'll provide those links in the description of this video. Color is one of those much deeper topics than what we really have time to do in a single video. As a matter of fact, practically entire degrees focus just simply on different variations of the color and palettes and things like that. And again, this is sort of the intersection of form and function. We're going to spend, we're going to spend a little more time on the functionality and a little less on the form. So if anything, all we want to do here is get a good introduction to how you can assign various different colors. Now, to begin with, what we're going to do is much like in the other videos, we're just going to use our favorite IDE, and we're going to create a new HTML page. And for the purposes of this video, we're going to stick to inline styling. Now, everything that we're going to do in this video can be then extended to having the style at the block at the top of the HTML document as well as external. As a matter of fact, you would argue that in order to be really useful when it comes to styling your pages, that you would push all of the colors out to an external CSS file. We won't do that in this video, but instead what we're going to do is we're going to keep this one pretty simple and just focus on the different methods for assigning colors. And so as such, what we'd like to do is create a title for this particular page. And so we're just going to call this one CSS Colors. And again, just like in the earlier videos, we're going to go ahead and throw in an H1 tag so that we can see the description of this particular page rather easily. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through the various different examples that we talked about at the beginning of this video, is these named colors, as well as then the RGB, the HEX, and the HSL. And I also want to do various different things with each of these mechanisms. And again, this is just meant to be a little bit of an introduction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually start off with something we've already done before, and I'm going to just simply insert my style attribute into my body. And what I want to do is I want to simply change the background color of my body using one of the named colors. And again, forgive me for this being almost an obnoxious combination of colors. That's sort of the intention behind this, is just to have a little bit of fun. So I don't think we've used chartreuse in any of our other videos, so I might as well go ahead and use it here. And before we go too much farther in this, what I want to do is go ahead and save this and go ahead and find your folder where you've been working in the previous examples. And again, what we're going to do is we're just going to simply call this one CSS Colors. Now, again, you can use your preview, or in my case, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to go out to the file system. I'm going to find that file, and then I'm going to display it in my web browser. I'm just going to bounce back and forth between my ID and the web browser and refresh the page as we make our changes. You'll notice that the H1 text is in the default black, and we've got this rather lovely background color. Hopefully this isn't too bad in the video. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through some of the other examples. We've seen how to set the background color using the named colors. And by the way, there's about 140 of them that are defined in the HTML and CSS support for all web browsers. So you've got a lot of options there. But what we'd like to do now is we'd like to break this down a little bit further. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to throw a whole bunch of different P tags in under different headers. So what we'll do, since we've got a couple of different mechanisms that we want to look at, we'll start with a couple of H2 headers. And the first one is going to be our RGB, which just simply stands for red, green, and blue. And the idea is that you can identify all three of the layers, the red layer, the green layer, and the blue layer. And specifically, what we want to do is we want to note that we demonstrate those values by using integers from 0 to 255. And if you've been in any of my courses or have worked any with RGB, you should recognize this then as 8-bit color depth for each of the layers for a total of 24-bit color depth. Now, again, the goal here is to sort of demonstrate this in line. I'm going to leave the headers alone, but instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put in some examples in these P tags. So we're going to leave this particular P tag alone, but we are going to insert one more P tag under here. And in this one, then what we want to do is essentially, again, use our inline style. And then what we want to do is, in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to change the color for the element. And in this case, instead of using the predefined colors, what I want to do is I want to use the RGB function. By the way, you'll notice the RGBA. We will come back to that at the end of the video. For right now, what we want to do is we want to focus on the RGB function. And what we're going to do is we're just going to start off by assigning values 0, 0, and 0. And if you're familiar again with RGB, you'll probably already know what this is going to result in, but I'm going to go ahead and specify this. So this should result in black. And sure enough, if we come back out here to our web page and refresh it, you can see here that in fact it is in fact black text. Now, what I'd like to do is to sort of make this example a little more helpful is I'm going to go ahead and put in the values for the RGB also in the text itself, just so we could sort of see what's actually going on here. So again, you could see here that this is going to be then RGB is going to be 0, 0, 0, which is going to result in a black. Now, we're going to do a little bit of copying and pasting here so we don't spend the rest of the video just typing. I'm going to create a couple of different examples of this here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to change now the first value in this RGB function to 255. And 255 is the maximum value for each layer. And in this case, that first value is for the red layer. And so what we should end up with is pure red. And sure enough, if we change this here also in the text, save the file, and then bounce out here to the web browser and refresh it, you'll see that the second example is in fact going to be red text. Now, what we can do is we can continue on with this theme real quick. We'll go down here, we'll modify the third example now to 0, 255, 0, which should result in full green. Why do I know it's going to be full green? Well, because the second layer is my G or my green layer. So in this case, there we go. We'll go ahead and change the value in the text as well. And then we'll come out here, we'll refresh our page. And that one's going to be a little harder to read. As a matter of fact, I think you could probably argue that we should probably change our background text. Let's come over here, or rather our background color. Maybe that chartreuse was not our best choice. So let's come back here and let's see if we can find perhaps a more useful color here. We'll go with our corn silk here, and then we'll come back over here. That'll probably make the next example a little harder to read, but this is essentially going to be a losing battle no matter which color we pick. Now, one final example, or rather a couple of final examples here that we want to do just so we can complete the RGB examples. And so that is going to be a complete 255 for the blue layer. So in other words, 0, 0, 255, that means full blue. And again, you don't have to go to those extremes. This is just showing you how you can do this with each of the individual layers. And then lastly, what I like to do is I like to make all of the layers 255. And what that should result in is going to be white. And so here, this right here is going to be 255, 255, and then lastly, a 255. And if I come out here and I refresh my screen, sure enough, you'll see there's my white layer down there, or my white font down there. This is going to be a little harder to read, of course, because of a lighter background, but you should get the general idea here that you can use this RGB function to create then text of all sorts of different colors. And again, what you'll end up with is 2 to the 24th possibilities as far as colors. Now, what we'll do now is we'll come over here to our source one more time, and then we're going to go ahead and sneak in another header here. This is going to be our H2. And in this case, what we want to do is we want to see how to do the same thing now with our HEX format. It's not exactly a function, it's just a way of representing the colors again as numbers, but this time what we're going to do is we're going to use the hexadecimal format. And fortunately, this isn't too much different from what we were doing with the RGB. Again, it's just a different way of going about doing it. The main difference, though, is that we're going to have values from 0 to F. And if you're familiar at all with hexadecimal, you'll know that those are the values 0 through 9, then followed by A, B, C, D, E, and F for a total of 16 values, hence hexadecimal. Now, the idea, though, is that what we're going to do is we're going to pair these together so that what we'll have is we'll have values that go from 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, all the way up to FF, FF, FF. And again, what you'll have is your R, G, and B layers represented this time not as numbers from 0 to 255, but from values and hexadecimal values from 0, 0 up to FF. And so what you should see here then is going to be the red layer can go from 0, 0 up to FF, likewise the blue layer and the green layer. Now, let's get some practical examples in here, much like we did with our earlier examples with the RGB. So again, I'm just going to use another P tag, probably going to use a bunch of these, and we'll have to do a little bit of scrolling, but the idea is to keep this example as simple as possible. And again, we're going to go ahead and use our style attribute. The difference, of course, is the syntax. And in this case, what we're going to use is we're going to use the pound sign to indicate the color. And so there's our color, and then we'll do simply the pound. And you can see here my ID is trying to help me out here a little bit. And so I'm just going to go ahead and specify 6 zeros. So 0, 0, 0, 0, and 0, 0. And what that should result in, provided that I haven't made any mistakes, is going to be our black color again. And again, I'm just going to mimic our earlier examples. So again, 6 zeros. Now, if we got this right, we're going to save this, bounce back over to our web browser and refresh, and you should see now the hexadecimal format. You'll see that my black down there rather uninterestingly matches the rest of my default form colors, excuse me, the default colors for the text. And so what we want to do is see if we can now do a red color for our second example. So let's go ahead and copy and paste our P tag. And in this case, what we want to do is we want to change the first two values of our hexadecimal format to FF to indicate maximum red. And so now this should be red. And again, I'm going to change this also here in the text, although that's just for us to see. And if we refresh the page, sure enough, there we go. Our red is now FF0000. Let's see here. I thought I had capitalized that. I did not. Simple change there. And then let's go ahead and continue on with a couple of other examples. Now, I believe that you should probably see the pattern here, but let's go ahead and do one more. So for the green layer, then of course, we'll just change the central 2 zeros to Fs. And so this should be maximum green, if you would. And let's go ahead and do the blue layer. And those are just simply the two last zeros that get changed to F. So that should be then maximum blue. And then, of course, the last example that we would be interested in for the sake of this video is just going to be all Fs, and that should result in white. And so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I might have gotten a little overzealous here. Let's count the number of Fs we've got here. 2, 4, and then 6. Yes, I think I got a little bit overzealous there. And we come back over here to our web browser, we refresh the page, and then sure enough, there we go. We have our red, green, blue examples and also our white example. Now, let's take one more look now at the documentation before we go any further and to talk a little bit about our HSL functionality. Again, what does HSL stand for? It stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. And this is going to be a little bit different than RGB and HEX. If you're not familiar with HSL, this is probably going to be a little bit more difficult of a concept. And again, I probably won't really hold it against you if you choose to stay with the RGB and HEX values, but it is much more useful when you start getting into fancier pages and when you're wanting to do color palettes and again make your page look more aesthetically pleasing, is to leverage HSL. Now I've went ahead and provided you an additional link also to the Wikipedia page describing HSL, but essentially what it is it's a different representation of the RGB color model, different interpretation of it. Again, it's a cylindrical coordinate variation on that. Very useful again in developing themes for your site. And again, this page sort of goes through a little bit of explains to you how the hue works and how the saturation works. But let's go through a couple of practical examples. I'm going to do a little bit different this time. I'm not going to necessarily match my red, green, and blue. And one more time, let's go back to the syntax real quick, just so we could take a quick look at it. And so you'll see here that much like with the RGB function, you simply provide it with 3 values. In this case, the value 0, 100%, and 50% will mean that you have 0 is red. The shade of gray will be the saturation. 0 means that it's going to be gray, and 100% means it's going to be full color, whatever that color happens to be. And again, go back to the representation of the color wheel to understand how it varies from 0, which is red, up to 360. And then lastly is going to be the lightness, where 0% is black, and then 100% is white or 100% light. So let's go through some examples real quick. What we'll do is we'll start off with, again, our header. So we're going to use our H2. This is for our HSL format or function, where we have hue, saturation, spelled correctly, of course, and then light. And so what to note here with the hue, saturation, and light is that the hue is going to be a value from 0 to 360. The saturation is going to be a value from 0% up to 100%. Let me clean this up just a little bit. And then lastly, the light is also going to be a percentage that's going to go from 0% up to 100%. So let's just dig into a couple of examples here. So again, do a P tag with some inline styling, just see how we would go about doing it. Again, we would want to sort of factor this out, put it either at the top of the document or into a separate file. We have our style. Again, going to specify our color. This time around, though, we're going to use HSL, and you'll notice that there's also an HSL and an HSLA, which we'll come back to in just a second. So we're going to stick with our HSL, and what we're going to do is we're going to start with the example that we saw on the W3 Schools page with the 0, which is going to be the red, the 100% for the saturation, and then the light, we're going to stick again with their example of 50%. And for text here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call this one example number 1, and we'll come back with some better ways of naming it in just a second. Now, let's go ahead and save this real quick. Let's come over here to our web browser and let's refresh our page. And you'll see that our example 1 essentially matches our red from earlier. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and put in the text what each example is going to be here. So this is going to be our HSL 0, 100% followed by 50%. Now, the easiest way to learn how HSL works, at least in my opinion, is that you simply come through here and you make a couple of minor changes. And so what we're going to do is we're going to change the second percentage to 100%. And this will, of course, be our example number 2. We're going to go ahead and save this real quick. Come back over here to our web browser. There. Oh, sorry. I forgot the way that I had formatted this. There we go. There is our example number 2 there. And you'll see that essentially what we've done is we've bleached the value. In other words, we've bleached the color to the point where it's represented as white. Now, in order to sort of get at least a basic grasp on how HSL works, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to the original example and I'm going to change it to 120. I'm going to leave the 100%, the saturation of the color alone, and I'm going to leave the lighting alone. The only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change essentially the color. So this is going to be our example number 3 here. And so what we're going to have here, if you save this one and then come out here and refresh it, then you'll see that we in fact do have our green. And again, that isn't too terribly surprising. Essentially what's going on here is that we start at red and we navigate around the color wheel through green and then ultimately through blue. However, what is going to be surprising is going to be this next example. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to once again just follow up with our example number 4, and we're going to leave the color alone. We're going to leave the 120 alone. We're going to leave the 100% for the saturation alone, but what we're going to do is we're going to change the lighting now to 100% as well. So essentially what we're doing is we're duplicating that second example with a different color. And you may or may not be surprised to see that when you refresh the page that you again get white. Essentially what you've done is you've bleached the color to its maximum. In other words, it's as bright as it could get. And so again, it's a little different way of thinking of the colors and the color wheel. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do this one more time. As a matter of fact, let's do both of them at the same time. We're just going to copy the previous 2 examples. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this now for our example 5 and 6. What we're going to do is we're going to use 240 as the base color. And you can probably guess it's actually going to be blue. At least that's what's going to look like in the 5th example. And then if you've been following along, you can probably guess that for the 6th example, we are in fact going to get white again. And sure enough, if we come out here and we refresh this, there we go. Our 5th example is blue, and essentially it's the same blue that we saw in our earlier examples for RGB and for HEX. Now, before we make this any more complicated, I do want to do exactly one more example here, and that is just so you can sort of appreciate then what changing the saturation does. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go all the way back to our first example, and we're going to play around with the saturation a little bit. We're going to leave the color alone, but we're going to do a couple of different variations on the saturation. So for our 7th example, we're going to sort of go through and do one extreme here to another. In other words, instead of 100% for the saturation, I'm going to leave it at 0%. And then for a little bit of moderation, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that to 50%. So the base color is still going to be red in both examples here, but for example 7, we've essentially turned the saturation of the base color to 0. And for example 8, then we're going to set it to 50%. Again, just so you can sort of get the gist of how this works. And so again, what we're going to do is refresh our page. You can see that our example 7 is actually sort of this weird light gray or medium gray. It's essentially as if the color itself, the red, has no contribution. In other words, if you think of the first value as being the color and the second value, the saturation, being the amount of the color, essentially we've chosen red, but we didn't add any of it. I know that sounds perhaps a little bit strange, but you can clearly see in the 8th example, then we're still using the red color, but it's at 50% saturation and 50% light. And so what you have is sort of this dark red, if for lack of a better way of describing it, this grayish red. And so, again, if you decide that you only want to use RGB and HEX, I won't necessarily fault you. I do enjoy working with HSL. It is an alternate way of designing your color palette. It is very, very useful. But again, for the purposes of these videos and for the purposes of the course, feel free to stick with your RGB and your HEX models, or for that matter, even the 140 built-in colors. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and thanks for watching.